We present episode 6 of Cottoning On by Geoffrey Banks, read by Nigel Banks. In this episode, we learn about Geoffrey's childhood expeditions to watch the Bolton Wanderers with his father, the lighter and darker moments of hospital visits after his father was in a serious road accident, and come to terms with his father's mortality, as well as his own.
In the 92 years my father lived, he wrote to me only once, on a point of information touching the architectural similarity of Portsmouth's town hall to Bolton's, owing to the fact that both buildings had been designed by the same man. He was much more literate than my mother, and his handwriting far more legible. Yet it was her runic scrawl which strained my powers of interpretation throughout the war and my university years. Mother's writing brought its fair share of mystification, and yet family correspondence was always left to her, as indeed were parents' evenings. For although education was my father's job, he resolutely skipped attendance and ducked every opportunity to discuss my progress with my teachers. Instead, it was mother who put on her hat and coat and hot-footed it along to school. It would never have occurred to me to tackle father directly about the matter, or indeed about anything else, and any mention of it to mother had her stoutly stonewalling on his behalf. She had only two defensive ploys: a reminder of all the exhausting night school work he undertook, and the claim that he was becoming pretty deaf. The latter plea was always advanced when I suggested he might attend a carol service, a musical concert, or the annual school play. It has to be said in fairness that he did attend all these functions. On the other hand, he only attended them once, for such appearances produced in him the same reaction as alcohol, betting, and truanting from work. Once tried, they were never tried again. When I reached my mid-20s, my dramatic performances switched from the school's vast and echoing assembly hall to the town's little theatre. So I suggested diffidently that he would have no difficulty hearing there, since the auditorium was constituted like a shoebox. But by now I knew in my heart that neither night school nor acoustics had much to do with it. And yet nothing agoraphobic ever dissuaded my father from regular attendance at Burnden Park to watch Bolton Wanderers' home fixtures. There he seemed able to insulate himself from surrounding spectators. He had been a competent soccer player in his younger days, and approached each match not as a fan, but as a student of the game. He certainly never considered himself a supporter, since anything remotely suggestive of togetherness, or a bit of a knees-up, had him bolting for cover. And while rabid partisans around him were bellowing their disgust at, say, a trigger-happy winger, he would simply state, "You should have squared the ball." That was not the only technical term to nonplus me as a boy. For instance, when I first accompanied him to Burnden Park at the age of 5, I attracted some attention from neighbouring spectators in the crowd by squealing, "Offside!" whenever the ball went out of play. It seemed so logical. The general amusement at my ignorance at once brought on an attack of my father's social malaise, and he promptly disowned me until half-time. Then, rallying somewhat, he promised to explain the offside rule to me one day, when I was older. But he never did, and I grew up almost equating it with sex. He didn't take me along to Burnden Park on a regular basis, but often enough to give me a taste for the rituals which surrounded the actual play, such as the vendors selling large cough lozenges in paper bags, lobbed unerringly, and for surprising distances, to their purchasers up in the stand, in exchange for pennies lobbed with varying degrees of skill in the opposite direction. When I admired the accuracy of the vendors, father observed, but ask them to bowl at a wicket and they'd miss. These days, sadly, The coins projected towards the playing area are aimed at opposition goalkeepers or the odd impartial linesman. The unsophisticated spectators of the pre-war era were satisfied with less hostile diversions. At half-time, for instance, as the brass band paraded up and down the pitch, there was that eagerly awaited moment when the man with the big bass drum had to about turn and always skidded on the sodden turf. It was cheered like a goal being scored. When professional football was resumed after the end of World War II, I was taken along to watch the first peacetime game at Burnden Park. For some reason, half-time was shortened from 15 minutes to a mere 5. The players did not even bother to leave the pitch. As we looked down on them, Father pointed out that whereas most of them were squatting on their haunches, 2 or 3 of them were standing with hands on knees. These were the lads, Dad informed me, who had not joined His Majesty's forces, but had opted instead, as was their right, to become temporary coal miners. Miners always stand like that when they aren't actually digging coal, he said. Very low ceilings, you see. I did not immediately see why the height of a mine's ceiling stopped him from squatting on his haunches like the rest of us. But we had just won a war. To insist would have been pedantic. I noted that one of those footballing miners was Nat Lofthouse, who later achieved fame as England's free-scoring centre-forward, and modestly enjoyed the nickname the Lion of Vienna, awarded him by the press after an inspirational performance in an international match against Austria. In 1945, however, he was simply known as Lofty, and as such it seemed illogical of him to have opted for the pit. After the final whistle, it was not my father's practice to launch into immediate post-match analysis, but to treat the business of departure as urgent. And so, one way and another, little was said until we got clear of the ground and embarked on the long shuffle to the tram terminus. When at some point Father delivered his verdict on the match, it was often confined to just 4 words. 2 bad teams today, and pronounced with that true northern masochism which finds its ultimate expression in gems like, "Lousy beer this, be glad when I've had enough." This episode is essentially an account of my father's journey from domestic dependence towards comparative self-sufficiency. At home, like the vast majority of his generation, and, be it admitted, a fair percentage of mine, he took care of the manlier chores, like chopping firewood, carrying coal, and replacing washers in taps. Everything else he unthinkingly consigned to his wife. Even after retirement from work, he was content to have her hoover around him while he read his library book. As for the kitchen, that was an area to be passed through rapidly on the way to the shed, the greenhouse, or the back gate. It would be fair to say that he had been spoilt rotten, since there were 4 females in the house to wait upon him. Even when 3 of them had departed for good, leaving only his wife, his acquaintance with household chores remained minimal. The man who, to begin with, had only shopped to gratify his own wild enthusiasm, 1/2 pound of sausages from Thornley's, the grocers, and 1/4 of their medium Lancashire cheese, plus 2 ounces of dark brown Virginia from Arthur Morris, the tobacconist, now had to diversify. After 2 years of stoically devoted attention, once mother had died and he was relieved of the burden of caring for her, he began to raise his head inquiringly above the parapet. For instance, I occasionally came upon him in earnest consultation with my wife Elizabeth on the subject, say, of the best way to cook Lancashire hot pot, and what he always called slack custard. If he happened to catch my eye at such moments, its expression became an engaging compound of bashfulness and bravado. The same duality was nowhere more apparent than in the street accident which befell him in the following year, and from which he was lucky to emerge with nothing more serious than bruising, lacerations, and shock. The cataracts forming in his eyes were a large contributory factor, but so was that weekly compulsion of his to walk round the town centre. Whenever we reminded him that there were shops just around the corner from his house, he dismissed it with the words, "I'm a town bird." Self-deception on such a scale must surely qualify for an award, for to have patronised on a regular basis only 2 shops in a town centre the size of Bolton's can hardly be said to constitute nesting rights. It soon became evident that the physical blindness which had obscured the approaching vehicle was matched by his mental refusal to accept responsibility for the accident. No question, it was the driver's fault for speeding. An extra shock to father's system occurred when he was told that he must on no account try to get up from where he lay until the ambulance arrived. As he related the story, hours after the event, his outrage was still acute. "Do you know," he said, "some interfering busybody had actually telephoned the infirmary?" Worse was to come, for a crowd had gathered, and for one who had devoted his life to the studious avoidance of the public eye, this was anathema. Finally, never having had dealings with casualty departments before, he was quite unprepared for the need to suspend all sense of time therein, and as the minutes ticked by without a word from anyone, let alone treatment, he became increasingly agitated by the remembrance that his younger daughter Sheila was due to descend on him for lunch. Suddenly, hauling himself to his feet, he began to make his way unsteadily for the exit, when he was confronted by the casualty sister. "A red-haired individual, Irish," he reported with mounting distaste. "A right desperado she was. Where do you think you're going?" she said to me. Dad gathered together the tatters of his credibility. "I can't waste any more time hanging around here," he told her. "I've got to go and get my potatoes on." Of course, they would have been Cheshires. He always bought Cheshires. In his last years, however, when arthritic hips curtailed his expeditions, it was Elizabeth who took on the buying of his groceries. But since Thornley's was off her normal shopping beat, she began to slip in other brands, and was scarcely astonished not to be found out. As for potatoes, she told him, if asked, that he was indeed eating Cheshires, when in fact he was being fobbed off with Pembrokes or Jersey Royals. And so a pleasing balance was achieved between Elizabeth's expediency and Dad's capacity for self-deception. "Yes," he would murmur sagely, "you can always tell Cheshires." He was less fortunate the second time. When the school secretary brought me the telephone message, I was teaching the 4th form. Having heard that once again he had been knocked down by a car whilst crossing a main road, I had a terrible urge to curse him out loud in the presence of 30-odd bewildered schoolkids. For the town bird had flown another mission, on the very day before he was due to go into hospital anyway to have his cataracts removed. Mercifully, during the drive from school to the Royal Infirmary, a sense of proportion was re-established, and I was able to remind myself how uncertain the demarcation line can be between tragedy and farce. When I arrived, Father was still in casualty, but perfectly conscious. I forgot everything I had rehearsed. All I could manage was, "Hello, Dad. What have you been up to?" The battered features produced the ghost of a smile. "I've done it this time, haven't I?" he asked. Later, when details of the accident emerged, a further irony was revealed. It had occurred at the very end of his expedition, within 200 metres of home, and the impact had deposited him almost on the doorstep of those local shops which he had so persistently ignored. This time he broke the car's windscreen, and a good deal of himself as well. One of the shopkeepers, an acquaintance of mine, had watched as they lifted him into the ambulance, and as father disappeared from view, he was heard to say, "By the way, I had a hat." It was to be his first experience of a hospital ward since that septic bayonet wound of the 1914 war. There was little reason to suppose that at the age of 87 he could survive. But we had overlooked the muscles that he hadn't even used yet. Musgrave Ward was long and bleak. He was anchored there for 6 whole months. It was a very long time before he asked to be reunited with his pipe and some dark brown Virginia. But when he did, it occurred to us that he was on the mend. It had been a long haul for us, too, maintaining daily visits. But we considered ourselves well rewarded each time to see his face light up. And, when we asked how he was today, to hear him say, no matter what they had been doing to him, "Oh, pretty fair." The staff came to regard him as a model patient. For unlike others, he never complained. The only regret that he expressed to us was that, anchored as he was, he could never get away from the Madikes, his way of referring to half a dozen youngsters who were there recovering from self-inflicted motorcycling injuries. Largely accustomed as they were to communicating above the din of revved engines, they would clock up the same number of decibels when merely requesting a bedpan. During one visiting hour, not long before he was due to be discharged, he experienced an alarming build-up of abdominal wind, which he had loyally, but only just, succeeded in repressing until the last visitor departed. By now, the discomfort was so acute that he felt compelled to ease it by ever so gently, as he put it, taking the top off it. But the moment I attempted it, he told me, I was utterly out of control. It was just like the genie in the bottle. You know, he went on and on. I was quite unable to nip it off. I was helpless. His voice became reverent at this point. All the conversation in the ward had stopped. Even the Madikes. They were riveted by the performance. When it finally drew to a close, there was a great hush. Then all those daft lads burst into spontaneous cheers, and they laughed worse than ever. Thus, ironically, only a few days before he was due to leave their company for good, father had discovered a way through to them. Now, whenever their paths crossed his, they gave him a grin and an admiring thumbs up. And during rare, boring moments of silence, they would even request an encore. As the wheelchair finally removed Dad from their midst, he made his exit to a round of applause, and the dubious accolade from one of them that he had produced longest bloody fart in Northern Union. As I led father very slowly towards his own back door at last, it became obvious that he did not envisage an idle convalescence. While the doctors were reassembling him, they had attended to his cataracts, so that now he was able to spot that a pane of glass was missing from his greenhouse roof. He stopped, peered, and then raised the rubber tip of his invalid's walking stick to point this out. "Oh dear," he said, "I shall have to attend to that." It is seldom easy to convince a man that his DIY days are over, but in father's case to do so was paramount. It had been decided at the hospital that the accident had so badly smashed and dislocated his shoulder that, once it had mended, any attempt to relocate it would kill him. It was therefore to remain permanently out of joint, leaving one arm seriously underpowered. That he could hobble up the path was a marvel. That his eyesight had registered the missing pane of glass was a total bonus. But that he should contemplate any procedure which involved the use of a ladder was enough to scare the pants off me. It was to be a nervy business over the next couple of years trying to head him off. We sometimes succeeded. To come upon one's incapacitated sire standing in stockinged feet on a shiny table in a one-handed attempt to change a light bulb was to re-experience those simultaneous urges to hug him and clock him, which may well have a cumulative effect on one's own lifespan. He hadn't wanted to upset the home help, he said, by scuffing the surface of her highly polished table, thus explaining the absence of shoes, but not the mountaineering. However, the need to get him down in one piece defeated one's urge to comment upon his Lewis Carroll logic. The neighbourhood watch occasionally turned up trumps. A tense voice on the phone saying, "Can you come round? He's dragging a pickaxe out." Another message began, "Now, you don't know me, but..." It was a report that the town bird had made one more take-off bid. He had boarded a bus near his home, stick in one hand, empty shopping bag in the other, and then, unbelievably, had started off up the stairs to the top deck. Before he had got halfway up, the type of acceleration applied by the under-gifted driver propelled him all the way back down again, head first. Amazingly, although badly bruised and shaken, the only fracture he sustained was to the stem of his pipe. His informant had been on hand to support father home and had promptly been requested to keep mum about the incident, but had been too concerned to keep his promise. Father was unable to meet my eye when I walked in, fuming. His armchair suddenly looked too big for him. I hastily revised the script to, "Hello, Dad. What have you been up to this time?" As an opening line, I was sick of it, but unable to think of anything better. This time he entered a plea of mental cruelty. His argument was that it caused him too much anguish to patronize the lower deck of a bus because he was one of the old school, and if the bus filled up, he was no longer able, in his condition, to stand up and give his seat to a lady. The fact that smoking was prohibited on the lower deck, alleged the defendant, was never a consideration. The town bird simply had to be grounded. In a bid to clip his wings, I tracked down the policeman who had taken charge after the original accident and begged him to produce an effective deterrent. He came and sat down with my father and took him, very gently, step by step, through his movements between getting off the bus and the moment of impact. Then, equally gently, he entrapped him. "And when you paused in the middle of the road, sir, and then set off again, were you aiming to get to the opposite pavement between the first and second of the parked vehicles, or the second and third?" Father floundered. "Parked vehicles?" he repeated. There followed a silence as he was left to digest the fact that he who cannot discern stationary vehicles will not have too much luck with those that move about a bit. Then, as he sat there, totally subdued, the constable briefly supplied the moral. As he was getting into the squad car, I thanked the officer sincerely for his visit. "My pleasure, sir," he said. "Prevention's always best. Nip it in the bud like." But we had scotched the snake, not killed it. 24 hours later, in some distress, Elizabeth reported Dad's latest reaction. "There was a bobby here last night," he told her, "trying to tell me things I didn't see." How ridiculous. I know what I saw. Nevertheless, there were not many sorties after that, or if there were, we never heard about them. His pursuit of independence was mainly confined to the garden, which offered challenges of a different kind, like the 10 yards of privet hedge. One-eyed and one-armed as he was still periodically moved to assault it with an electric trimmer. And afterwards, he would look at the carpet as he said, "You'll never guess what happened today." And, panto style, I always answered, "Oh, yes, I will." It was the home help's husband whom father regularly persuaded to repair the severed flex, so that he could persevere with his hedge trimming, incineration-proof. Although his lawnmower was mercifully non-electric, it was also innocent of petrol, a manual model of the heavy cylinder variety. His only way of propelling it now was by gripping one handle with his good hand and pressing against the other with his chest. Mowing operations were almost invariably carried out during my working hours, but if he was ever delayed and I managed to surprise him in action, I was always shaken by that compound of the epic and the farcical, as he toiled behind the machine, carving eccentric patterns in the grass, in his new, dedicated Groucho crouch. On the occasion of his 90th birthday, Elizabeth and I travelled down from Kendal, where we now lived, to visit him at home along with my elder son Nigel and his partner. To celebrate the occasion in appropriate style, we had taken along a bottle of champagne, as well as his other gifts. We found him ensconced in his usual armchair, dressed as per usual in his tweed jacket, cavalry twill trousers, collar and tie, pipe in mouth. After the customary greetings and exchange of family news, it was suggested that the champagne be opened so that we could toast the birthday boy. He accepted this idea with his characteristic caution. I wouldn't mind. After the cork had been duly popped and the drink poured, we looked on with interest as he tentatively sipped the wine. There was a beautifully timed pause as he put the glass down before he delivered his verdict. "Ah, so that's champagne, is it? I'd rather have a glass of pale ale." In the end, it was the loss of balance. During much simpler operations, like taking in his milk, lighting a spill at the gas fire for his pipe, and, worst of all, falling from his bed and being unable to climb back again out of the cold that clipped his wings permanently. Now at last, his daughters succeeded, as they had often tried before but failed, in bearing him away for good, to live out his time in what he thought of as the slummocky South. He offered only a token show of resistance, and the removal duly took place. It was just a month or two later that he confided to my sister Jean's sympathetic American visitor that he was ready now to go and meet Mrs. Banks. I had not been told about that when I went down to see him for what would be the last time. He had had a collapse, but had rallied strongly and was sitting up again and eating pretty well. And so, as I left him, I didn't say, "Look, Dad, it's quite possible we might not see each other again, and there's something I need to tell you." I gave him his usual kiss, said cheerio, and turned back in the doorway for the usual bit of a wave. 3 days later, my sister held him as he drifted off. There is a mass of unopposable evidence to the contrary. Yet I discovered that a tiny irrational part of me had gone on, fatuously, thinking him immortal. While he remained, I had no real need to grow up. 10 years on, it is still a niggle that he died when I wasn't looking.
And that was the final episode of Cottoning On by Geoffrey Banks, read by Nigel Banks. Studio recording and editing by Robert Burgess, and this was an Old Dolly production.